what is a conservation easement? A conservation easement is essentially a contractual agreement between a landowner, so a private landowner, and a qualified organization. So this comes to Bill's question. And a qualified organization has to be one that's recognized by Canada Revenue Agency as qualified to do that. So it is a non-profit charitable organization that has listed in its objects that it will protect land for these purposes. And so universities do not have that purpose. They have the research piece, and they can anybody can own land, right? Whether you're a private institution, government, whatever. But from an easement perspective, they're not considered qualified. Is that fair, Jason? Do you have anything to add to that? Okay. So that contractual agreement between the landowner and the qualified organization, and they're all listed on a federal government website who's allowed to hold easements. Essentially what the landowner does is they give up certain rights or certain opportunities to rights that they have with land, and we'll get into that a little bit more. That conservation easement agreement is then, once it's negotiated and agreed upon and all of that, gets registered on the land title. And so it goes with the land title over time. It doesn't come off when the land transfers, whether you sell it or give the land away, that easement stays there. So every subsequent owner of that piece of property can pull that document out of land titles and read it, and they know exactly what the restrictions or the requirements are in owning that piece of land. And that may or may not affect the fair market value of that property. There's lots of theories that it does, and I'll get into valuation as well. But so that's essentially what it is. So if you consider land ownership as a bundle of rights, so you own this piece of property and you have the right to cultivate, irrigate, harvest trees, graze, the right to build something on it, the right to request subdivision, or opportunities. Rights gets to be a bit of a touchy term sometimes, and so we tend to present it as opportunities, but that's the language that goes around. So you consider property ownership as that bundle of the ability to do things to it. And then when you get into a conservation easement, you take some of these rights, and in this case I think we moved, I forget the animation on this. Yeah, the ability to build or subdivide, you're going to give up that opportunity or right to ask your municipality if you can do some development or do some subdivision. That goes into an agreement that that qualified organization then holds. So you have this contractual agreement between them. So you own a piece of property that you can still, in this case, cultivate, irrigate, graze, and harvest trees from. Usually there then will be put property management principles around it, so you can't just do it willy-nilly. You have to do it within certain either ecological practices or sustainability approaches, sustainable approaches that you agree upon with that organization. Does that make sense? Is there any? So this is why are we even allowed to do these things? So as I said, every province in the country has legislation around this. They all put it in different places. In Alberta, we originally had it in something called the Environmental Protection and Enhancement Act, and that started in 1995. I think we were the second or third province to bring on legislation. Ontario was the first. And but in October of 2009, that legislation enablement got moved from the Environmental Protection and Enhancement Act into ELSA, the Alberta Land Stewardship Act. So we've been doing easements in this province for about 16 years, and as I mentioned earlier, there are 9 active land trusts. We have a lot of active municipalities that also do easements. The Land Stewardship Centre, whose executive director is Brian Olnicki, I'm sure some of you have met Brian, recently did a project for the province, and there are hundreds of easements that are held by municipalities. It was quite shocking to a lot of the land trust people. They're like, what? What have these guys been doing? So anyways, just so that you're aware of that. So in general, it's not a new tool. It's also been used extensively internationally, and in the US they've been doing easements for decades. What we had from the start was the protection, conservation, enhancement of biodiversity. When it changed into ELSA, they expanded biodiversity to say environment, natural, scenic, or aesthetic values. Personally, I'm not aware of an easement that's specifically done for that purpose. They get named sometimes, but it's generally not the main purpose that I've seen. I could be wrong, but. And then new, when it got moved into the Alberta Land Stewardship Act, we added agricultural land. So we now have the same as Ontario has done, by including farmland or agricultural land in that definition. I think that's there. And then if it's set up for those first 3 reasons, then it can also be for the next one. So they can be for recreational use, open space, environmental education, or scientific research or scientific studies as well. So conservation easements can be used simply as conservation easements. A land trust wants to make sure that, or a municipality wants to make sure that land is protected as such. It's not available to put a mall on or condominiums on or something else on, but and that's all it is. It's simply that agreement, and we keep the land open for the purposes outlined in that. They can also be an anchor for other kinds of conservation programs, and I'm going to talk a lot more about transfer development credits in a bit. But they can also be used for conservation offsets. So I'm not sure how familiar everybody is, so we're just going to do a little quick definition of a conservation offset. But the idea is that something negative happens to the environment over here, and we're going to offset it by protecting something over here. There's all kinds of ways that can happen, but one of the things you can do is put a conservation easement on it. That sort of is the insurance policy that property will always be protected as the offset for the negative impact on this side. It can be the basis for payment for ecosystem services programs. There are a variety of programs around the world where it's either done by government through tax-funded dollars, or it's done by industry, where a landowner manages property or a land manager manages property in a certain way that it produces some kind of ecological service, so whether that's a carbon sink or a biodiversity credit or all kinds of things, and that may also be backstopped by an easement. So the landowner can't participate in the payment program until they have a conservation easement. That's not how all of them are done, it's just an option for use. Cluster developments, which we're going to talk about again in a little bit, but the municipality may, or a land trust may, allow for a certain amount of development on a piece of landscape in exchange for an easement across the rest of the property. So you have conservation development or cluster development, those are called. Another option is grass banking. This is something that happens a fair amount in the Great Plains of North America, but in particular in the US, where a land trust or a conservation organization owns a large chunk of land. In exchange for allowing people to come and graze it, they have conservation easements registered on their private land. So it's a bit of a give and take on a grazing arrangement. And then there's a variety of others that they could be applied, but these are a few. So there was some discussion in our introductions about restrictive covenants, which is somewhat unusual when you come to things like this, but a restrictive covenant is another way that land can be conserved, and in those cases you need to have a dominant property and a subservient, so one benefits from the conservation of the other. In the case of a conservation easement, that's not a requirement. The other, these are sort of just purposes or the nature, pardon me, of conservation easements. So essentially what it is it's an interest in that property for the qualified organization. So once they've registered that easement, the municipality or the land trust has an interest, even though the landowner still owns that property. They own the fee simple title. And just need to highlight that if certain things happen, there was non-enforcement of one of the clauses, or the land use is inconsistent with the purposes of the easement, or there's a change in surrounding land use, that doesn't automatically dissolve or lapse that easement. So that easement is there as a contract regardless of sort of those things happening. People can argue against them and you can get into debates on them, but because those things happen, they don't automatically disappear. So this touches on what Roger had said earlier about who can hold them. So in the Alberta Land Stewardship Act in Alberta, the province of Alberta can hold them, or a government agency, as well as local government. So predominantly those are counties and municipal districts. But they can also be Métis settlements. They also have the ability to hold conservation easements, as well as land trusts. So land trusts must have within their documents of formation that they will hold the interest for land conservation specifically. They need to name that's why they would hold an easement. They also have to have something in their papers that says that they will, if they were to dissolve, that they would transfer their interest in property to another qualified organization. So that could be government, that could be municipality, or another land trust. And they must be a registered charity, so they must be on the list of the CRA. A conservation easement must also be registered at the land titles office, and in advance of doing that, notification has to be given to the local government, that so the municipality or the county that the easement is in or the property is in, to the Department of Transportation and the Department of Infrastructure. They all receive notification. They do not have the option to yay it or nay it. They can just they just know that it will exist, that the easement will happen. So. That was new in the Alberta Land Stewardship Act also. It used to just be the local government received notice of it, but now transportation and infrastructure have been added into that as well. So even though that, there's a lot of detail there, and actually writing the agreements can take a lot of time, that's the easy part. The next part is making sure that those conservation easements are upheld. And so this is in the land trust world and in the municipality world for those organizations or those local governments that do easements. This is called stewardship, and that requires monitoring, education, and it requires time. And so predominantly what that means is that somebody needs to make sure that everything that happens on that property within the confines of the agreement. I mean, if the agreement says you can build a house, you can build a house. But if it has other restrictions, if some people will put in grazing management plans, some people will put in forest management plans. So if there is to be any grazing or logging, it needs to be made sure that those requirements are documented and followed. So most organizations do an annual monitoring visit. Most organizations are very open door with the landowners that they work with. So some do newsletters, some have internal blogs that they share. So, if, say, the Canada thistle is really bad this year, they might do an outreach on Canada thistle management, or it should be regular. So the regular contact, as constant as possible, open door stuff is good, because the landowner then has that relationship with the land trust. It becomes a give and take relationship. Oh, I need to know how to do water management. The land trust runs out and finds that information to help them do that. At the same time, so that's the nice, warm, fuzzy side. On the other side, the information that gets collected, the data gets collected, it needs to be defensible. The U.S. experience shows us that it's not generally when an easement will be challenged, or not if, it will be when. And so, and sometimes they're minor, like, somebody bought a property and the deck was falling off the house, and so they decided to build a deck, and they went, oh, let's add 10 feet onto it because we've got a big family, and they weren't supposed to do that. There was a really tight building envelope, and they went outside of that. So things like that, they become a conversation at the kitchen table. Well, it doesn't really affect the purpose of the easement, so we're going to let it go. Or actually, you just went into that really rare plant species that we were supposed to be protecting here, therefore we're going to have to pull it back and do restoration on it. So those kinds of conversations happen. They're the simple, easy ones. Sometimes they're more blatant than that. Somebody bought a property and it had a conservation easement on it, and they decided they didn't want it, so they just ignore it. And then the land trust has to make sure that they've done their due diligence and that they've got information to take forward. So that's why the stewardship monitoring side is really important. And I get a little bit nervous when we talk about that, because I don't want people to ever be scared off by it. And I've sat on boards of organizations that get really scared of it. It doesn't have to be scary. You just have to be aware, and you just have to make sure that if you're in this game, that you're doing what you're supposed to do. If you've done your due diligence, you just build policy around it, you do it. It's really not that difficult. You just have to make sure you did it. There's costs related to that land trusts need to be aware of, that municipalities need to be aware of. Visits to make sure that the properties are being and doing what they're supposed to be. Communications with the landowners, whether a newsletter costs money, whether it's a little short paragraph or not, it still takes time, right? Record keeping and efficiencies. So that efficiencies for municipalities means you can write a really simple conservation easement, or you can write a really complicated conservation easement. If no building and no subdivision covers 80% of the things that you're trying to protect, like if you want to make sure that the Class 1 soil is protected and there's 5 acres of Class 2 soil, then so be it. That's the building site, right? And so if nobody comes in to apply for a building site, you know that it's fine. Like that, you can make it fairly straightforward and simple. Any questions on that side of things? So I've already touched on this to some degree. How are they enforced? So you do find a problem, what happens? A lot of times it's just a discussion in good faith. You're sitting across the kitchen table, you know what, we noticed this. Oh yeah, you know what, I had to have my cows in that area because we had an excessive hailstorm come in or snowstorm come in and then we were starting to calve and I had to move them. Okay, like that makes sense. It's excusable, it'll be managed out, it's not a big deal. Versus you cultivated all your fescue prairie. Oh, right? Like that's, you got a different conversation happening at that point in time. If it is something a little more serious, then every conservation easement has a mediation arbitration clause written into it. So it will give you the process that you're going to go through. Organizations really hope that they don't have to go there, and most landowners hope that you don't have to go there. So as I say, you know, like a high percentage of some of the issues, they're easy conversations, but it is all built in. Enforcement can be done by the qualified organization that holds it. There's also room in our legislation to name a designate, like to have somebody else do the enforcement. I don't know anybody who has used that. Like every conservation easement I've seen, the organization that holds it is the one who does the enforcement. So. Some people have talked about having the government do all the enforcement, but we haven't got anybody in government to agree yet. So it hasn't actually been a very serious conversation, but there has been that conversation over time. So one of the questions that comes up is, can conservation easements be changed? So you know, a landowner went through this process, they did all the negotiation, the conservation easement got signed, 10 years down the road something changes, can they, in their personal circumstance, can that document be changed? According to legislation, yeah, it can. There needs to be a written agreement between the landowner and the qualified organization that allows for that change to happen. There can also be the minister of, at this point, a Minister of Environment and Sustainable Resource Development is responsible for the Alberta Land Stewardship Act. They can make that change if it's for the public benefit, public interest. So there's lots of issues that go around defining that, of course. However, there are lots of checks and balances that keep easements from not being changed. One is most of the land trusts in the country, and I think all of them in Canada have, or in Alberta, pardon me, have signed on to the Canadian Land Trust Alliance has a standards and policies document, and standards and practices, sorry, and it outlines how to handle these kinds of requests and situations. So a lot of organizations are getting to the point where at the front end of the easement, they have a landowner write a letter that says, this is my intent, this is my purpose, this is my objective, this is why I want to do this. And the land trust will, if they continue on the negotiation at that point, they've agreed to it, right? They've said, yeah, we agree with your intent. And then the document gets written. So if a change were to be brought forward 10, 15, 20 years later, maybe it's not even by the original landowner, they'll often go back to that original letter of intent and say, oh yeah, this change fits, it's okay, we'll go for it. Or it doesn't fit. No, they had no intention of having a dance barn. We're not allowed to have dance barns. So and in fact, I recently were helping out with an easement, and the landowner said, I want nothing commercial ever allowed here. That's a huge request, and I really tried to talk him out of it, but I don't think I'm winning. Anyways, because the landowner, future landowner could prove that hurts them, right? That they're not allowed to have a greenhouse or whatever, right? Like there's a whole bunch of opportunities for argument and holes to be shot in that. But the other big stopper to changes are the eco-gifts. So eco-gifts or ecological gifts is a program that Environment Canada and Canada Revenue Agency run. And what it does is it gives the donors of a conservation easement special treatment. So they get the ability to use their tax receipt longer. They don't get charged capital gains for a deemed disposition. When you put an easement on your property, it triggers a deemed disposition. But through this, they don't get that, so it's a capital gains exemption. And but they're also getting really sticky. They want to see every bit of information that happens on that property. And so if there were to be a change, and this happened in Ontario, there was a conservation easement that allowed for a building site. We'll say it allowed for it on the east side of the hill. Well, when the landowner came forward and said, I want to build the house, but I want to put it on the west side of the hill. And here's all the reasons why, and this matches our intent, and you know, it's going to save everything. EcoGifts actually wouldn't let it change. They wouldn't let it change. They said, nope, this was the original document that went through. It went through a whole bunch of negotiation. I don't know how it ended. But so there's that check and balance too that says, no, it's sort of that extra set of eyes. From a farmland perspective though, there's not an ag gift program. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, you're just taking the words out of my mouth.
Okay.
So that's only for environmentally sensitive lands, is it not?
Yes and no. There's a few gray areas, so this is exactly where I'm going. And I'll give an example with the Ontario Farmland Trust in a little bit, but there are a number of conservation easements across the country that were given eco-gift status, and they may have some bit of agriculture in them. So they sort of say, okay, well, you know, on this 380 acres, 90 acres is a cultivated field, the rest is wetlands and native prairie or parkland or whatever, and within this matrix of cultivation and natural landscape, the biological or the ecological values that we want to protect have survived. Therefore, we're going to, you know, they certify it as eco-gift. The eco-gift requirements are listed on their website, and they're pretty general. You know, I think if you went on a quarter section that was cultivated corner to corner to corner, it probably, you know, I don't know that it wouldn't qualify or not, but that doesn't, it's not really the intent of the program. But some level of agriculture that is not, like, grazing is easy, right? Like if it's on native grass, that's it's an agricultural activity, but it also has some ecological benefit if it's done well.
But it was set up for environmental.
It was set up for environmental purposes. To be clear, absolutely. No, no. So another question that often comes up is how are landowners compensated? They've given up these rights, they've had that bundle, they've split it, what happens at that point in time? So sometimes they simply achieve their personal conservation goals. And it was fascinating to me, as I mentioned earlier, we come from a region that is a working landscape. I did some work a number of years ago and interviewed a land trust in British Columbia, and they had 200 easements that the landowners took absolutely no compensation for. They didn't want a tax receipt, they didn't want any money, they felt really good that they'd done this. And so that's one factor. And most of those were on properties that are recreational properties that have been in the family or they have some emotional connection to, right? They're not properties that anybody's ever expected to make a living off of. So I think we have a difference just in our landscape and how our social fabric fits with that. But that is one way of compensation. More common ones are tax receipts. So land trusts, municipalities, provincial government are all able to write a tax receipt, and I'll get into valuation on what that is, but somebody makes a donation of a conservation easement, they get a tax receipt back for a certain value. The other is a cash payment of some kind. These are less common in Canada than they are in the US, and there's all sorts of different permutations of them in the US, but often they're called PACE, or payment for conservation easements. And then the next one is split receipt. This is, again, something that came from the US, but we do have in Canada now. So you can receive a partial payment and then a partial tax receipt for the value of that conservation easement. And then the other one, which is often the compensation given to landowners for easements that municipalities do, is some kind of development relaxation. So they may be able to add, you know, another acre, but then they put an easement on the rest of the property, or they can put an extra like a garage with a suite in it, or, you know, something that's a little bit different in exchange for conservation. Okay, so compensation and how is it determined? So in a donation, often they do what's called a before and after calculation, and I'll show you a diagram on that in a minute. The reason that is done is because most times when we use, this is a fair market value assessment, so it's a real estate assessment. It's a fairly common, people who are members of the Appraisal Institute of Canada are the ones who do these, just the same as they do any other real estate transaction assessment. They do this way because there are not enough comparisons to compare what the price should be, and so they do this before and after. Cash payments are generally a percentage of the fair market value. So both Ducks Unlimited and the Nature Conservancy have a program down around the Cypress Hills, and they pay 20% of fair market value. So if you enter into an easement in that area and the property is worth, I don't know, $100,000, we'll say, your cash payment is $20,000. So it's just flat, straight, easy. Split receipt, as I said, it's partial cash and partial tax receipt. It cannot be more than 80% cash. So you can get, it can be any combination below that. So if it's 70% cash, it's a 30% tax receipt. And then the development relaxation is up to the municipality to decide how they want to implement that or not. So this is the before and after part. And so you have your full land value. You have your full land value, that's 100% of, so somebody goes out and says this land is worth $3,000 an acre. Then you have, so there we go, the value of those rights that you gave up. So the ability to develop, the ability to build is a certain value, has a certain dollar value. If you can no longer do that on the property, that decreases the value of the property, right? So the difference between what's left and what you started with, that's the value of your tax receipt. So you have an extra slide, which is the same as the slide before in your printout there, I think, but did I catch it in time before I printed? Do you have the how is compensation determined twice? Yeah, cross it off. So this one is looking at a land trust conservation easement versus a municipality conservation easement. Effectively, the document's not going to look a whole bunch different, right? It's an agreement between a qualified organization, it's a contract, you put it on the land title, all of that's the same. But a land trust versus a municipality, they have different mandates, they have different objectives. And so the land trust has a very clearly stated, it's usually for the protection of environment, scenic value, or agriculture. Municipality, their objective or their mandate is to provide good government, safe, viable communities. And so when they do conservation, whether it's of farmland or environmentally significant land, they're doing it to fit that bill, right? So that's just a different view of why they would enter into it. We kind of saw some of that in our discussions earlier for why governments would be interested in this. So their conservation purposes are a little bit different. The whole objective of the land trust is to do that conservation. The municipality is going to fit that into something else that they're doing. It's either going to go into a growth management strategy or a food strategy or a conservation strategy. You know, it's going to fit into some other kind of program. The parties that agree are obvious. The two parties is the landowner and the land trust, or the landowner and municipality. The trust column on here, or the next row, pardon me, is it's a really interesting thing. When you sit down across the table from a lot of landowners, you get very different perspectives on why they would want to do with a land trust a conservation easement or with a municipality. And even within the land trust community, do I want to do with a big national organization that's going to, you know, have a certain amount of backing or clout that they visualize, or do they want to do it with their neighbors, a local land trust? And that's a very interesting conversation to see people. I'm not working with those people from, you know, wherever, Winnipeg. I want to work with somebody that I know. Or other people are like, I don't want neighbors knowing what I've got going on. I want to talk to somebody who's from far away from me. And the same thing happens with the municipality. They may say, well, you know, that land trust is nice, but it's voluntary, and it's this and it's that. My municipality, they're not going anywhere. Versus, or the other, right? Well, the municipality can change their decision, change their mind. They can change what they want, what they think is important. You know, so these are just the trust piece is just how landowners might view one organization versus the other. The financial benefit or the compensation is essentially the same, other than a municipality can perhaps relax some development restrictions. Conservation planning. Predominantly, in here we have conservation easements. I'm not sure that that's 100%. Land trusts own a fair amount of land also. Some land trusts only own land. They don't do conservation easements, or they don't do very many of them. Land trusts, when it comes to development planning, may or may not be at the table. I would say very few in Alberta are at the table when it comes to overall landscape planning involving other organizations. Most of the land trusts tend to be fairly focused on their objectives. Not all of them. There are some that are involved in regional efforts and that sort of thing, but most of them tend to be, these are our objectives, this is what we're after, versus municipalities. They're trying to fit it into a bigger picture. They're trying to fit it into that societal good that they're supposed to be protecting. Both can participate in eco-gift programs, and the restrictions, the bottom part there, and you'll have it there too, but the restrictions are developed based on the land trust's mandate, what their objectives are and what they do, versus the municipality is probably going to base those based on the programmatic. What's it fitting into? Is it growth management? All those sorts of things. Does that comparison make some sense? Does that help, Jason, with the land trust versus municipality questions you have, maybe? Or land trust questions?
Yeah, very much so.
So there are two municipalities that I've picked today to talk to you about how they've used conservation easements. And both of them are around Edmonton, and some of you may know their examples better than I do, but so if you hear something I say that's incorrect, by all means jump up and say so. The first one is Strathcona County, which is to the east of Edmonton. They entered into a large number of conservation easements in the late 90s, early 2000s, and what they were doing at that point in time was trying to, municipalities have a variety of tools to do protection, environmental reserve easements, and ERs. What's the acronym? Environmental reserve, yeah, sorry. Municipal reserves as well, but they have a different purpose. But the environmental reserve and the environmental reserve easements are designed to protect areas that are not developable, so steep slopes, wet, like really wet areas, marshlands, those kinds of things that you can't build in, and then a certain amount of other environmental features. What Strathcona County was finding is they wanted to do a little bit more from a protection point of view, and they wanted to do more upland protection, and they didn't really have a tool that they could do that with. So they started implementing conservation easements, and that was the reason. So they often, or always, came with a development application, and so the landowner would ask to do some type of change or development there, and part of that was to do a conservation easement on a certain amount of the remaining land. Beaver County is just southeast of Strathcona County, and they did something similar, but it wasn't an upland thing they were trying to do. They were trying to protect a larger area of the wetlands. So with ERs and EREs, there's a percentage maximum that you're able to protect with them, and what Beaver County wanted to do, particularly in the moraine area, was protect more than they were allowed to do with that. They did not make it a requirement of subdivision. They suggested that it would be a nice thing for the applicants to do, and they didn't have to. It was voluntary. I'm not sure if they gave tax receipts or not, but it was not a requirement of subdivision. As soon as it's not a free and clear gift, you can't give a tax receipt, but if it's a voluntary action, then you can. And so they had a very high response rate. I think, I can't give you the exact number, but it was very high. Most people went ahead and did the easement. It fit with what they were trying to do in their development anyhow.
Sorry, these are private landowners?
These are private landowners. Private landowners. Well, if you're building on a piece of land that's not been built upon before, then I guess to some level you're a developer, right? But not commercial developments. So I've already mentioned the Ontario Farmland Trust and the Helio Trust in Nova Scotia, and the Ontario legislation, I think it's in there. Manitoba's the Conservation Act. I can't remember Ontario's. But they also, as I've said before, have named agriculture as a purpose. The Ontario Farmland Trust formed not as a result. I think these things were very push me, pull me kind of things. The Ontario Farmland Trust wanted to be, the government wanted somebody to be that, and so these things came together. And Guelph, the University of Guelph has been very active in stewardship and in farmland conservation over the years, and this is one of the publications that they've put out. I think it was in '07, and Stu Hiltz in particular is a researcher at the University of Guelph. He may be retired now, but they have done a pile of work around this, and they were really the impetus both for the legislation and for the Farmland Trust starting. Ontario has a really interesting history too with land trusts. They have a lot of them, and they've had for a long time something called an Ontario Land Trust Alliance, and the Ontario Land Trust Alliance was also very proactive in having the legislation changed to include farmland, even though a whole bunch of them did not name agriculture as one of their objects. They felt that there were enough landowners there who were asking for it, that at least if it was in the legislation, there would be more organizations that would start. It's sort of a build it and they will come kind of philosophy. So that's what's happened there. So Ontario Farmland Trust has done 2 to 4 conservation easements specifically on farmland. They also do a whole bunch of education and awareness programming. They've got a mentorship program where they match young farmers to older farmers, and they have land exchange stuff. They do a whole variety of programming around that. But on their easement program, all of the easements that they've done to date have fit the eco-gift criteria as well. So they've all had a food-producing component within a forested area, within a water area, within a grassland type landscape. Helio Trust doesn't have the legislation to back them, and the easements that happened on their properties were done to devalue the land in order to transfer it to younger farmers, so that they knew it would stay as farmland, and it's gone into a mentoring program. So they have blogs and all sorts of information to help younger farmers get involved with local food movements and things like that. In Alberta, we have 4 kinds of land trusts. We've got the local, regional, provincial, and national. Locally, we've got Edmonton Area Land Trust, Foothills Land Trust, Crooked Creek Conservancy, which is up around Athabasca, and the Bow Valley Land Conservancy, which is out in Canmore. Bow Valley Land Conservancy is actually really interesting. They were established to protect 2 properties. That's it. That's their job. And so there's lots of people who want them to do more, but that's what they were established for, and that's okay. Land trusts can be 1 property, they can be 100 properties. They're really quite flexible, and I come back to what I said about the Land Stewardship Act, that it's really up to the people to decide what it is that they need in their community and their society to achieve that. Regionally, we have Southern Alberta Land Trust down along the eastern slopes, and Western Sky is a regional land trust out of Calgary, and I've mentioned them already. They cover probably 5 or 6 municipalities that they're interested in working with. And ELTA may fit that too. I've always sort of called them local, but they may be a bit broader, I'm not sure. Provincially, we have the Alberta Conservation Association and the Alberta Fish and Game Association. And then nationally, we have Ducks Unlimited and the Nature Conservancy that are all active here. And as I mentioned earlier, only one of them, and that's the Foothills Land Trust, actually names agriculture as one of their objectives in their mission statements. Everybody else is either environmental alone, or also include a heritage or a cultural piece.